Welcome back to the Acceptable Chess Weekly Roundup, where we take some time to look back and celebrate our successes, lament our mistakes, and learn how to do it better next week. I'm your host, John Harden, here with National Master Andrew Hoy. And Andrew, unfortunately, there is no next week. Next week. And why is that?
Well, we've wrapped up the tournament. So we had a very exciting round seven, and Aaron was able to put the game away and win the tournament by a commanding lead. So this was a really exciting way for the tournament to end, and I think we've really had a great tournament. All seven rounds, all seven games that everybody played were exciting and interesting, and we're really looking forward to the next tournament because this one's in the books.
Absolutely, yes. And congratulations once again to Aaron finishing with that clear 6.5 from 7. But we actually also, I want to take a moment here and just congratulate a few other people. We did have some other performances in this tournament that I think should not be overlooked very quickly. Rufus Bear, Brian Curry, and Lenny Shogun, if I am not mistaken, are three players who all finished with a full 5 points from 7, which is still an excellent performance, especially when there is some sneaky difficulty to playing only one game a week, right? Maintaining that focus, I think, over a 7-week period is not easy to do. And although we saw some occasional dips from these players, I never saw anything that couldn't be said to be solid competitive play. So congratulations to them as well.
Definitely. It was really a fun tournament, and there was a lot of really exciting chess as we went through it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Looking into this week's rounds of games, we have a number of different topics and trends that we are going to consider as we analyze these competitions in tonight's broadcast. So, the topics and trends for tonight, we have number one, avoid passive play. You want to make sure that at all times during the game, you are doing what you can to pursue an active plan. Keep your moves oriented around something that you're shooting for and go for it aggressively. This helps keep the game being played on your terms instead of being dictated by your opponent. Number two, don't overpress. So these two, there's a little bit of opposition working with these two ideas because, of course, it's important to maintain activity, but we also want, especially when playing white, to not always go out and feel that we have to win the game in the first 9 to 10 moves. Sometimes this ends up compromising our position, and the counterattack ends up being the kind of decisive result that we were looking for from our initial effort. And finally, a more subtle strategic theme for the ending of our broadcast, we're going to look at restricting the opponent's good minor pieces. Figuring out between the knights and the bishops, who among these four pieces on the board is your opponent's most effective, and trying to shut that piece down, either by trading it off, which is, of course, the most direct approach, or, as we'll look at a few points in tonight's games, restricting and disabling that piece in order to create a crippling disadvantage for your opponent. And, of course, throughout all these games, we will, as always, be looking at tactics, tactics, tactics. Moving straight ahead into our first effort this evening, we had an impressive win by Dave Morrissey against Jalal Azoulay. Now, I have to say, Dave has marked his play throughout this 7-week tournament as being pretty unusual. He loves incredible aggression and going straight for the throat. But this game worked out by far the best of any of his efforts that I saw over the 7 weeks. So we had an interesting sequence of moves at the beginning. After Salal offers the French defense with the black pieces, right, intending perhaps to play d5, Dave plays an interesting move, but one that I have seen before, which is actually to play e5 off the bat, perhaps with the idea of taking en passant. Now, I have to mention at this point, there is a sort of minor theme that I wanted to discuss tonight, which is this idea of the en passant capture. Many times when I'm looking at my amateur players' games, my students, I see that either player is either afraid of having his pawns taken with en passant, or on the opposite end of things, very, very enthusiastic about taking en passant, regardless of the consequences.
Just
And I
because
think
it's legal doesn't mean it's necessarily the right move.
exactly. In fact, with experienced chess players, Andrew, let me go to you on this. You would say that en passant is sort of kind of a prosaic, regular, dull detail that may be very easily ignored, right?
Maybe. I think that said, it's usually a good idea to take something en passant when you have the opportunity to, but it definitely isn't compelled. We're not playing checkers. We don't have to capture just because it's legal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we will look at least a couple of opportunities in tonight's games where taking would not necessarily be recommended. So it's interesting at this moment, Salal forwent the traditional d5 move. And I spoke to Salal recently, and he said he was worried about this en passant capture. But of course, there's nothing to worry about here, as if white does grab this pawn, black is going to get a pretty typical French defense structure, but with a lot less of the space disadvantage that black usually suffers from. We see that black can very easily develop his king's knight, for example, which normally is a bit of a liability in a lot of these games. Okay, so proceeding on, right? We had some somewhat unusual play. The knight is on c6 instead of being able to play c5. But here's where we start to see some of this problem of passivity. Because while Dave is activating his pieces and bringing them into the game, Salal, I think in order to reach a more familiar pawn structure and plan, puts the knight back, basically taking 2 turns completely off from playing the game. Because, of course, he's made this knight move twice and has nothing to show for it. Right? We see Dave waste no time, right, immediately playing the best move in the position and striking at the center to try and open things up and create active play. Right? I think now perhaps taking back with bishop c4 would have been more normal and solid, but still he cannot be too criticized for playing bishop g5 and putting a threat to the queen, right, continuing this sort of boulder rolling downhill momentum. He does stumble a little right here and ends up dropping a piece. But I think what's interesting is that the energy that he has in the position is such that he was still able to provoke a mistake from his opponent, right? Salal is having a little bit of difficulty trying to figure out where to put his king's knight. And although knight e7 is a very normal move in a lot of French structures, here it unfortunately does give the piece back, as this bishop is now completely undefended. And Dave pounces immediately, not giving his opponent a second chance to save the piece. Honestly, as much as I had to say about the beginning of this game, we're already basically at the end, because right after this, Salal makes an unfortunately huge mistake, although it doesn't look like one. He castles. Now, I'm normally always talking to my students about making sure you castle, but here this is definitely an example between the amount of space that white has on the king side, right, this pawn restricting some of the movement, and the fact that all of white's pieces can come swarming in. This is definitely an example of castling into it. And Dave, although I think queen h5 might have been a little more accurate, or even just taking on h7 right away, we see very quickly this leads to a decisive checkmating attack. So a nice effort by Dave, and I think some easy things to work on for Salal, just making sure that even if you get in an uncomfortable position, to remember the principles and keep developing.
Definitely. Yeah, that was definitely an interesting game. So let's jump right into the next one. And this game was between Danny and Steve. And they started off with a Caro-Kann defense. And now Danny had a little bit of a mixing up variations with f3. F3 is a normal opening against the Caro-Kann, the fantasy variation. This is a lot of fun. A couple of my really good friends, really strong players, play the fantasy variation because it offers white so many attacking chances. But here, playing F3 after knight C3 is less good. And that's because it immediately gives black the D4 square. And this is something that after D4, black is definitely in the driver's seat. White is forced into a passive position. He has to go back with the knight. And now I think that the cleanest way to have an edge is to play e5 with black. And after e5, the knights really don't have a future. You don't really love doing something like this to your structure. Something like this is going to be really rough on the dark squares, even though it's not mate because we do have knight g3 here. But it's still not something that you would write home about. Instead, we had a really creative move, d3, and I really like this move. So I think e5 is better, but d3 is a very exciting way to play, and it's an attempt to really ruin white's pawn structure and tie down all of these kingside pieces for the entire game. So after pawn takes, we took back with the queen, and now knight f4 was a double attack on the queen. Both the bishop and the knight are attacking the queen, so black moved the queen out of the way. And now, unfortunately, the game just ends. White played bishop d3, and the knight is hanging here. Instead of bishop d3, d4 would have been an attempt to get back in the game, and I think after d4, white is actually better. So this is why e5 to just take over the center and control the pieces that way would have been better than playing d3. But anyways, after bishop d3, e5 doesn't spoil anything. Both pieces are hanging, and black was up a piece and went on to win very, very quickly. We were able to see a couple more straightforward, aggressive moves from black. Black developed the rest of the pieces, brought the knight in, and now white made the mistake of trading queens. Although black could have traded queens earlier, now it's very decisive because there's very little going on for the white pieces. There are no threats. And I think this was the final thing that we want to take away from this game. If you're down a decisive amount of material, you must keep the queens on, pretty much at all costs. Any other move other than trading queens would have at least kept white in the game, and white might have had a chance to come back from that.
Absolutely. I will say we've seen many times in this tournament, especially in earlier rounds, where one player doing very well abruptly hung mate and won and ended the game. So it's certainly a thing that could have still happened here, even as well as Steve was playing.
Yes,
Moving,
definitely.
moving forward, we had another effort from one of our perennial strong players, I feel, against Lenny Shogun, against Andrew Larimer, who has really come on in the latter rounds of this tournament and started to play some very good games himself. But in this game, I think he got a little bit away from some of his stronger efforts, and we saw a problem that I have seen Andrew come into before, which is, again, a little bit of passivity in the opening. So Lenny makes an interesting offering, right, going for the c3 or Alapin Sicilian. So the idea here of playing the Alapin is essentially for white to try and play this move d4 without having to give up the pawn center, right? In normal open Sicilian lines, we play something like d4 right away, and as a result of c takes d, we don't have a big, impressive snowplow, as we sometimes call it, in the middle. So c3 says, well, why can't I have this, right? I'll play c3 first, and then when I play d4, I'll be able to get the kind of position I want. This is a legitimate and a dangerous plan, and black needs to absolutely play actively in order to exploit its difficulties. One of the things that probably makes the most sense is to recognize that the temporary placement of the pawn on c3 takes away the knight's best square. So something like d5, right, striking back in the center right away and creating some open lines for black's pieces can not be fought against as well as normal because the knight is not able to offer any control of that point.
In fact, we actually see the knight coming to a3 in a lot of these Alapin lines because the c3 pawn is in the way, and the knight still wants to get active on the b5 square.
Thank you. Absolutely. Yeah, very good point. So d5 would have been a nice move here and very normal. And I think also, Andrew, you know a little more about this than I do, but perhaps knight f6 is also a move?
Definitely. And the idea is by attacking the e4 pawn, white has to answer the question, how are you going to defend that? And knight c3 is no longer legal, so generally white will play e5, and after knight d5 we get some sort of structure that gives black plenty of play. If d4 is eventually played, we can take, and this knight has a very nice square on d5. Black's bishop can still develop to a good square, and this is something that's been tested all the time in top level play, and it's just one of the more exciting openings in the Sicilian.
Absolutely. So this might have been a better way to go. Unfortunately, because I think Andrew was a little bit unfamiliar with this play, with this strategy, right? He messes up the move order a little bit, and although his position is still reasonable, after e5, I think in order to maintain his position, he's got to play something like knight d5 right here, right? Keeping pieces on. And I think actually here, black could be okay, right? He's got a clear plan for developing, and he's still got some reasonable control of the center. Although taking, I think, is natural to try and make sure this pawn is a weakness and not able to be defended, it creates a lot more open possibilities for his opponent. And after knight to g4, things are getting a little tactically loose, right? Something like d5 would make sure you're not hanging any material. The knight certainly has a possibility of coming back and grabbing on e5, but I think after Lenny secures it with queen e2, this knight is starting to look a little silly out there on the sidelines.
Definitely. We really don't want to play knight g4 unless we are going to be able to win that e5 pawn. And here, white just has enough moves. In fact, he played bishop f4 to hold on to that e5 pawn. And that means that eventually white is going to be able to play h3 and kick the knight to a lousy square.
Absolutely. Although I will say tangentially that I love, right, this move f6 is definitely not playing passively, right? I have to say that he is going for glory here, trying to take advantage of the fact that the bishop is temporarily loose. And something here like bishop g3 would probably be one of Lenny's better options in order to make sure that the bishop is secure. So a nice move from Andrew Larimer here. Unfortunately, he loses the thread very shortly thereafter in the complications after h3, deciding to basically, as we saw in the previous game with Danny Finn, take everything and hope that it works out for him. But in this position where black's king is still in the middle and the queen is on him, all of this capturing is unfortunately only going to work out one way, as both sides pick up a minor piece, but suddenly the queen is in your living room and it's not looking good. White was able to secure his king, right? After queen d6, we get a trade-off of the lady monarchs, but still there is significant pressure coming on this piece. Even after the queens have been traded, the fact that he's stuck in the middle is a little bit of a liability. I wonder, there's a possibility here maybe of trying to maintain the right to castle, but Andrew, I think probably that Larimer was right to try and just tuck his king on f7, right? This pin to me looks kind of suspect, don't you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think king f7 is really the only move that makes sense in this position. It's important to connect the rooks as soon as possible to fight against the white activity. And I think king f7 and then finding a square for the bishop after a move like knight c4 or putting a rook on d1 is the easiest way to play the black pieces here.
Absolutely. It's a tough bid, right? There's not going to be any really exciting move when you're already in a difficult position, but I think that this is the right way to play it. So h5 is certainly seeking some active possibilities, but maybe not the best play given that the bishop has no opportunity to really come into the attack, right? This f4 pawn is really proving to be quite annoying in terms of getting anything going. White develops his pieces nicely to the center. Andrew drops back. Okay, we get another developing move. And unfortunately, after h takes g4, we see another set of exchanges, but ones that are, again, going to be in white's favor as the rook gains the 7th rank. And we can already see through the use of our special X-ray machine that there is a fatal threat operating on e7 that is coming just mere moments from now, with the explosive knight to d6 check. The king moves, and suddenly we are up an entire piece, with more to come, I think, with the rooks also loose. So the game right after that honestly ended pretty efficiently. It was some nice play by Lenny to wrap things up, make sure that nothing happened that wasn't in his plans, and after a couple of simple trades, black gave up the ghost. So a nice game played by white, and I think a few opening things more than anything for black to look at as to how to deal with a somewhat unusual plan.
Definitely. So let's look at the game next between John and Nick. So this was another interesting game. This actually started off as a 4 knights, and I've played the 4 knights for both colors for a while. and this is one of the main starting positions in the four knights. Here, the main move is castles. Other moves just kind of lose right away. It's a little bit surprising. D6 runs into knight d5, and where the knight is way too active, black cannot take because of this pin. Even though black's not going to lose material, black's position goes downhill very quickly. Similarly, a6 is not a good move because we can capture on c6 and this e5 pawn is loose. The important difference between this position and the Roy Lopez, to just go back immediately, is that the e4 pawn is defended. So in a position like this, we don't have the idea of knight takes e5 because queen d4 will attack the e pawn and the knight. But unfortunately, in the game continuation after a6, we are not able to attack the e4 pawn. So a move like d takes here, we can just move the queen back and white's up a clear pawn and has a better center control. So seeing that, Nick took towards the center, which is kind of the principled way to do things, and developed with the knight. And white certainly up a pawn, better center control, doing very, very well, but there's still a little bit of play for black. Here, instead of d4, another idea is to play knight d3, and I've actually had this game over the board against another strong player, and this position is an interesting way to play. Technically, black is even on material, but this knight and this pin on the e-file is going to lead to ruin right away. A move like f3, attacking the pin's piece, and white will win a decisive amount of material. So instead of that, white played d4, and now after d6, white had the nice move knight takes d6, c6, excuse me, forking the pieces, and white was able to collect a piece and go on to win. So here, white did put the game away very cleanly. One other idea here would be to take with the pawn. This e-file is a very strong file for the white rook, and for example, castling is not good to get out of the way because the queen is hanging here.
Yeah, one of those little niggling details
Exactly.
that we all love to miss.
Yes. White took back with the knight, and after black castled, white played knight c7, and this fork meant that white was going to be up an entire rook, and white put the game away very cleanly after that.
Yeah, absolutely. Have to say, very proud of John Morgan for sticking it out. He had a very tough initial set of rounds in this tournament. I'm really looking forward to seeing what he does. I hope he'll join us back in October.
Yes, definitely.
Moving forward, right? So we've seen a lot of opportunities for more active play, or sometimes some active attempts that went a bit wrong. And I think we're going to keep on that line of thinking as we look at this next game, right? As we look at this effort here between Robert Larimer and Nate Humphrey. So once again, Robert starts with his beloved English defense, but English opening, excuse me. But we see, my mind was going immediately to where we end up, which is after d4, we have actually transposed into a Slav defense. So very suddenly we're in a d4 opening, which changes the character of the game a little bit. The game proceeded fairly normally. I do not like this passive move from Robert, this h3 move. It seems entirely worried about nothing to me. I am not concerned about either knight g4 or bishop g4. So I think that this is wasting valuable time. But otherwise, I think that white plays very reasonably. And actually, it's black who ends up wasting a little bit of opportunity after this bishop d3 move. Right? I think here, the most normal plan for black to play in the Slav is actually to take this pawn, right, after the bishop has developed, so as to waste a little bit more of white's time having to go get it. And then this somewhat odd-looking move, b5, right, starting action with the queenside pawns and seeking to put the light-squared bishop on the long diagonal where he can find employment. As you can see, one of the big downsides in playing in these kind of semi-Slav structures is that the light-squared bishop doesn't seem to have anywhere to go. So this might have been a more active way for Nate to employ his pieces. Instead, he went for c5, which I think is aggressive, but maybe doesn't find quite as much active play. As we see after these initial few moves, we are still having to deal with this piece.
So, John, I actually disagree with you a little bit there. I think that because white took the extra time to play h3 way back on move 4, we have this opportunity to play c5. In the line that you give with b5 here, white's move bishop d3 gives him nice control over the center and the king side. Black must respond with c5 at some moment. C5 right away is going to hang the b5 pawn, so generally we see black playing a6 and then c5 in some order. Because white had the time to play h3, black does have this chance to play c5 right away. And it just leads to a really double-edged position and something that gets a little bit exciting. And actually, as we see from the next continuation of the game, black is able to saddle white with this isolani on d4. And this isolated d-pawn can be a good attacking platform. White has extra defense on the e5 square. White has ideas of playing d5 at an opportune moment and either sacrificing the pawn or recapturing to trade off with more active minor pieces. But in this specific position, black does have the opportunity to play a move like knight b6. And had black played knight b6, which picks up a tempo on the bishop, black would be able to put a knight on d5 and really lock in this weakness on d4. So I think that's kind of the thing that I saw in this game. Black was almost correct with this c5 idea, and had he found this knight b6 to d5 idea, he maybe can follow it up with moves like b6 and bishop b7 to really, really lock down this d5 square, and I think black would have taken a clear advantage right out of the opening that way.
Oh, very good. I think I'm always willing to listen to correction and education. And I think, yeah, perhaps I was being a bit too dogmatic about the traditional ideas in the Slav. But in any case, moving forward, I do think that the development of this light squared bishop does become a thematic issue in this game.
Definitely.
As we can see here, right, after a little bit of maneuvering by both sides, I thought that, excuse me, I will mention, this is certainly good play by black, playing a6 and seeking to just put the lights out immediately with a nice b5, forking both pieces. So good alertness by both players, for Nate for going for it, and Robert for seeing it coming and tucking his bishop out of the way. Right? Black goes with b5 anyway, and is starting to find some more activity, and I thought here would be the critical moment to, again, go for this bishop b7. This connects the rooks, right, and lets him bring the full strength of his army into play. Just imagine, I told Nate after the game, just imagine how happy you'd be being able to throw a rook onto c8 after clearing the bishop, right, winning yet another tempo on this errant queen. But unfortunately, instead, Nate was guilty of a little bit of overpressing, right, and tried to just go for the knockout blow immediately, playing bishop a5 with the idea of rerouting to c7 and trying to play for some kind of checkmate on the h2 square. It's not a terrible idea, but it does waste valuable time and avoids of developing the rest of his army. And we see Robert, again, showing great alertness, drops the bishop back to h4 and meets this bishop c7 with a crushing bishop g3, which X-ray attacks the bishop on c7, and because of the queen on c2, creates a winning twofold attack where he's going to go up a clear piece. The game then descends into immediate chaos, right? Nate offers this e5, trying to keep things closed up and maybe escape.
Well, it doesn't lose a piece right away, so it can't be that bad.
Exactly. Absolutely. But Robert is undeterred and continues to move in with his pieces, right? Making a feint at h7 and bringing his last few undeveloped pieces into play. I think probably a cleaner way to pick things up immediately would have been actually just to play bishop takes e5 right now, right? This renews the threat, and the problem is that if black tries to trade off, we have very nicely d takes e, and we are going to come home with that piece we promised our children at the beginning. So, moving on a bit, this is where I think things shift, one would think decisively, in white's favor, where black buys a poison pawn on queen takes d4 And Robert, not missing a beat again, right, immediately opens the discovery on the queen, right, and picks up the lady for a pittance, right? But it was not to be. Despite White's decisive advantage, right, after a few more moves in trying to bottle up the Black King, he ends up giving up an amount of material that he doesn't need to, right? Queen to c3, offering a checkmate threat, right, was met with king f7, and now Robert gets a little bit too eager, and instead of collecting a free piece, plays queen g7 anyway, which gives up the knight. Now, at this point, he's still okay, but moving on a little bit, we see finally, after a few more moves, king e3, a perfectly sensible move, and now knight takes g2 was tried, right, offering the knight fork, but missing very simply that knight takes g2 gets rid of this threat and probably decisively ends the game. Unfortunately, Robert, maybe in an effort to pick up time on his opponent, or maybe just assuming that disaster had fallen, misses this idea and lets the lady go. And after this, unfortunately, there really wasn't much left to do, and Black was able to gather the full point without any more drama.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. It's important to not believe your opponent too much. Just because your opponent makes a move or has an idea, there's no guarantee that it's a good idea or a good plan. It's something that we really fall into in blitz games, especially. Your opponent will make a threat, and we defend the threat without worrying or wondering if it's a real threat at all.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Andrew, we had another effort that cannot go without mentioning tonight, which was between Alex Host and our champion. What happened there?
Yeah, this was a really the game where Aaron was able to put the tournament out of reach. He was able to take a commanding lead of the event with this win. So we started off with a Nahdorf, which is one of the most exciting openings in all of chess. This pawn structure with a6 and d6. a6 looks absolutely ridiculous, but it controls the b5 square, so it's not all bad. And now after bishop g5, this is basically the main line. There have been many hundreds of games, probably even thousands of games in this position, and the main move is e6. Unfortunately, e5 is known to be a mistake. e5 gives up a large portion of control of d5. There's no more pawn that can control that, and the move knight f5 gives white a very nice advantage. White is going to capture on f6 and then put a knight on d5 with a crushing hold positionally on the d5 square. Perhaps Alex hasn't studied enough Nahdorf games, so you can check out a bunch of Fischer games instead. And after e5, he played knight b3, which is a normal response to the e5 break in most other lines of the Nahdorf. So instead of bishop g5, if bishop e2 or bishop e3, then after e5, we do want to put the knight on b3. So now Black gets a pretty nice game. He has everything that he could have hoped for. He's going to be able to play for this d5 break, and now we get kind of a decisive mistake. So after knight d5, Black played bishop e7 to defend f6 and to break the pin. And now bishop takes would have given White pretty nice control of d5. Black doesn't really want to capture with the bishop. The queen would come here. There's ideas of bishop c4, and the other idea that I really like in these positions is some sort of rerouting of this knight to add it to the d5 square. And this is a very slow plan. It usually doesn't happen for many, many moves, but it's something to keep in the back pocket. You just want to put both knights on the d5 square.
Andrew, I've got to break in here
Sure.
also and note that very often players are loath to exchange the bishop for knight here, thinking it gives their opponent the bishop pair. But one of the things that I think is notable in this position is that the bishop really is not so good on f6, and we see that its awkwardness keeps it from really being able to hurt White too badly.
Exactly. I think if we were going to look at this position back here, we would definitely pick the knights and the light square bishop as Black's best minor pieces. So by trading off this g5 bishop, which does not control d5, we trade off a piece that can control d5, and now we, white, have 3 pieces that can go to d5, and black only has 2 minor pieces that can go to d5. So it's just a way to think about the position to find a move like bishop takes f6, even though it does give black the bishop pair, which is generally accepted to be good for the side with the bishops. So with that lead in, unfortunately white played queen d2 and allowed this tactical shot, knight takes d5. And now we're attacking this bishop twice, and really the only try would have been pawn takes, so that we're attacking this e6 bishop. But unfortunately bishop takes g5 picks up a tempo by attacking the queen, and in this position white realized his mistake and played h4 to try and make the position messy. But Aaron, showing the extremely nice touch that he's had all tournament long, found the move knight f6, going right back to the square that he came from, and he was able to collect the full point without too much effort. So just
now, Andrew, yep. Forgive me, but I just have to ask, when the knight goes out and then the bishop takes and the knight comes in, what picture does that remind you of again?
You're exactly right, and this is something that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, and I'll give you the this is your phrase, so
the boomerang knight trap. As far as I know, I have coined this term, although I certainly did not invent the tactic. Right, something that I'm going to keep watching out for from all our players. I love to see Aaron execute on this, but all of you are on notice. Stop giving this up to your opponents. It's very famous, and I've made more than enough of a deal out of it.
Exactly. So just to go through the rest of the game relatively quickly, I do like f3. I think it's a way to try and make the position messy. White's going to castle, queenside, and just fling the pawns up the board. White's already lost. There's nothing to lose. We don't have to worry about positional considerations. We can just attack with abandon. Now that said, Aaron very calmly played d5. Black has an extra piece. We should open up the position and try and get to a position where we can take advantage of that extra piece. And now, once again, we see this boomerang tactic. The knight comes back to d5 yet again, and this time it was really enough to close out the game. Black was able to trade off the strong dark square bishop, and now he was able to start launching his pieces against the white king. Here, a move like king b1 runs into bishop takes b1 with check, and then black's going to trade off the queens, and this is just a decisive amount of material that black is going to be up. Instead, after a3, black did trade the queens, and then he put all of the pieces in the center. White did get a pawn back, but it really wasn't enough. And here, just one more moment that I wanted to mention. Playing bishop d3 to hit h7, white would have a little bit of compensation. He's really going to pick up one of these queenside pawns, kingside pawns. Even a move like h6 is going to run into something like this. Taking is actually a little bit dangerous. The moves g4 and rook h2 come very quickly. So this was probably the last chance. And again, this is something that the computer doesn't really appreciate, how to make it difficult for your opponent when you're lost. So that's why I want to really focus on moves like bishop d3. Chess is hard. We all make mistakes, even in a winning position. So this is kind of a way to have a little bit of sleaze in the position, a way to win some extra material, get a couple of pawns, get a couple of active pieces. And I wish I could tell you that I've never been in a losing position in my chess games, but I'm frequently in a losing position, and I have to come back with these tricks, and really sometimes dirty tricks, and bishop d3 would have been a way to try and do that.
I have to say, of all the chess players I've met, Andrew, there's no one sleazier than you.
Thank you. It's something that I strive for, clearly. So without further ado, we got to a pretty nice position for Aaron. He did not hang mate in 1 with rook h8, an laudable goal, and he was able to continue putting his pieces on good squares, putting them in the center, capturing more material. And now this discovery is a very nice trick. Bishop d3 is threatened, so now we really run out of material for the white attack, and black just has that extra piece, and now it's an extra rook. Oops, let's not
Yeah.
click. Okay, there we go. And now there really wasn't anything left to do, and the rest of the game kind of finished without further ado.
Yeah, absolutely. A really nice win to close it out from Aaron. We do have an interview with our champion, which I am looking forward to airing. But unfortunately, let's just say that some of the dialogue on the part of one of our participants was a little too blue for this channel. So I am looking to see if I can edit that down to a family-friendly version, and we will hopefully be airing that over the weekend. But it did not make tonight's broadcast. I apologize for those of you who were excited to see it. We are excited to share it with you, and we will. But for now, we are going to continue forward and looking with our last 4 games. So our next effort, we wanted to look at Ted Vogt versus Chip Rutan. And again, I think the major theme to look at here is that White is guilty a bit of overpressing. So I think we have some very reasonable moves from both players to start. Right? Certainly, I don't always love expanding this early with H3 and G4. I think sometimes, right, you can end up regretting these weaknesses later. But White is not castled over there. As long as your king is not forced to live under this roof, I think it's perfectly okay. Right? I think the real problem here comes after an initial couple of threatening moves from Ted, right? He seems to kind of lose the thread, right? He's got some nice developing moves and some initial pressure on the C6 knight with this pin, but now doesn't know how to follow up. And I think something here that probably is worth a look and very typical is actually to continue with the strategy that he's started, right? Pushing something like H4 to try and crowd this light squared bishop, right? An immediate threat to win a piece. Not letting his opponent have any time off at all would have been a reasonable shot. Or perhaps, I think probably not out of the realm of possibility, is to play bishop f4 and continue developing. Right? This a3 move, I think, is already starting to be a little bit too afraid of his opponent. And unfortunately, although I like the next couple, here, White has already got to be very careful. And I think probably needs to bail out of this attack. Something like knight takes g6 would avoid losing any material, and he could keep himself in good state. He is not castled. Black has taken the opportunity to take care of his position. So all of this attacking has ended up, although with some passive play, it's ended up getting the consequences of an overpress, which is that White is not developed and Black is. So after the passive bishop d3, Black took over the game, right, taking everything possible, winning a pawn, and suddenly was in the driver's seat and up material. Now, I will say the one other thing I really wanted to make note of in this game is I don't like trading queens here for the opposite reason from earlier, right? Black made the decision to trade queens. My metric that I have learned from my coach is very simply ask yourself whose king is more safe in the position. Now, clearly, without the ability to immediately get castled, right, White's king is going to be less safe. So I like trying to keep pieces on, right, and trying to make this king miserable as long as possible. Even if he does get secured, I think I've got more attacking chances than he does because of these extra central pawns. So that's something that I would have gone for, but I can't fault Chip. He was able to come away with the point on this one. And in particular, he used his center really effectively. Note how this pawn duo is keeping any trouble from happening. The knight is denied the e4 square. The f5 square is of some danger, but I think if knight to f5 is coming, right, just king to f8 will deal with that. Oh, excuse me, forgetting myself, right? Chip denies him altogether with g6. That's a nice prophylactic move,
Our third
right?
theme of the night, restricting the opponent's minor pieces.
Absolutely. Yeah, really nice play. We can see this knight is just completely without a future. Okay, so after a few more moves here and some exchanges, we see the rooks are coming to the center, and this is the last thing I wanted to leave in viewers' minds. The connected passed pawns, the active rooks, and really nothing for White to do in terms of active play, right? And a quick conversion after some gradual pushing up the board brought the White resignation. The rook is entering on the 7th rank, threatening to play rook f2 checkmate, but also pick up even more material over on the queen side. And it was just too much for Ted to want to take any more. A nice win from Chip Rutan.
Definitely. All right, so let's hop to the game, and I believe this one was between Tyler and Bill. And Tyler has had he had a rough start to the tournament, but he really kind of played a nice game here. It unfortunately didn't go his way, but I still want to make a note of just the fact that he really did play a nice game right out of the opening. So right out of the gate, we see that White has all of this pressure on the e5 square. And if you're looking at any of these bullet games that Nakamura is playing, he's always playing b3, bishop b2, and trying to take on e5. So bishop b5 really continues with that goal. And I think bishop b5 is a good example of what we talked about a couple of weeks ago, developing with a goal. And in this case, the goal is going to be control of the e5 square. So black really has to do something to hold the e5 square, and white is going to put all of his minor pieces with the goal of capturing the e5 pawn. So bishop e5, we're immediately threatening to win that e5 pawn. A move like e4, well, we have ideas of bishop takes g7 winning this exchange. Not that we would necessarily do that right away, just because there's no rush. But in this position after bishop d7, I like this move bishop takes c6. By capturing that knight, we're going to win this pawn on e5. And now black probably misjudged. He thought that the e5 pawn was more crucial than the extra minor piece, so he played f6 to hold this pawn. And unfortunately, that just gives away a whole piece. And whatever positional considerations you're thinking about, material is king. This is modern chess. If you can win material, it's worth it. You might have to defend, but there are all sorts of gambits and sacrifices that have been disproven in the last 20, 30 years, especially with the way that engines are playing. They will grab the material, they'll grab an extra pawn, and they'll just defend tenaciously. So if you can get an extra minor piece right out of the opening on move 7, by all means, grab that extra minor piece. And conversely, there's no reason to give up a minor piece. I'd really rather be down an exchange or probably even a queen for a rook in the middle game than to be down a clean minor piece like we are here. So after bishop takes d7, queen takes d7, we definitely want to preserve castling here for black. And now I like the way that white played with c4. Black develops. Black realizes that he's lost. He's down material, so he's going to just develop all of the pieces and go for broke. And I like this plan of opposite side castling. So black castles queen side, white castles king side, and now black's going to just hope and pray that he can get something to happen. So we start off by capturing. Now we have a little bit of a pawn weakness, and now h5 is the consistent move. We must attack. When you're down this much material, you have to go for mate. And even if you can't get mate, maybe there will be some sort of attacking plan that forces white to sacrifice the material back. All right, so black starting his attack. This is kind of the key moment where white could find a move to totally diffuse everything. And this is one of the oldest principles in chess. An attack on the flanks should be met with a counterattack in the center. Had white played d4 here, this really ends everything. Yes, we're technically giving up a pawn in the center, but we have an extra minor piece. This extra bishop is really the only consideration in the position. And if white played d4, well, everything's traded off. There's no more mating attack. And even if we lose this c4 pawn for nothing, and we don't have to lose the c4 pawn, we can play a move like rook e1 and rook e4. We're picking up this tempo on the knight. I think that even with the bishop against the two pawns, the b and c pawns, this should be winning for white. So this would have been a chance to really take advantage of the extra material and close out the game. All right, so back to the game. After h5, instead, white played knight a4. Now, knight a4 is a little bit messy. We're starting to put the knight under fire, and I think after queen d6, I don't love queen d6. Now white did find d4. And let's just go through a couple more moves. We had a few moves in the middle that really didn't contribute to the fight. C5 is a nice idea. We trade off this minor piece, and now black once again is really just hoping for whatever he can get. Black is down 2 minor pieces now. Here, a move like queen b3, threatening to trade queens, threatening the b7 pawn, would have been a nice way to try and put the game out of reach for black. Rook b1, also a totally fine move. If we're really looking at what the perfect move for white would be, maybe it's rook b1. We're getting an extra attacker in, we're trying to take advantage of this queen, but we're practical players. None of us are perfect. Trade off the queens. You have 2 extra minor pieces. Even if you lose the d4 pawn now, it really doesn't matter. It's just get the queens off. There is nothing that can go wrong.
My first boss in chess teaching, Chris Mack, had some wonderful wisdom on this point. He would say to our scholastic players, "You all want to lose exciting. Just win boring."
Yes, definitely. Along those lines, I'll be giving a simul on Sunday, and I hope for many, many boring wins. All right. So, back to our game. Black continued to develop the pieces. Black doesn't really have to calculate if something can go horribly wrong after a move like bishop a3 or knight e6 or knight d7 or knight takes b7. Black's already losing. There's no need to worry about beautiful tactics to try and win. Just put the pieces on good squares and maybe something will happen. All right, so black successfully keeps the queen and does not lose it. And now we get a couple more developing moves. And now I think here is where I think the game starts to shift. Even here, we have an idea of rook takes b4. And the idea is that we can try and win this minor piece back. But unfortunately, I think too much material comes off, and white's going to have 1 clean extra minor piece. So white's lost a piece. But it really doesn't matter just because there's so much that white still has. White still has a knight for a pawn, and white's going to be able to play a move like queen e2, defending a2, getting a tempo on the king, and a move like king d7 would just end the game immediately.
I had a visceral reaction to that move. Yeah, that would have been the game ender for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah, opportunities just to trade things off and win boring, unfortunately, abounded in this game for white.
Yeah, definitely. So let's go through the next couple of moves relatively quickly. We kind of trade a couple more pieces. A3 is a nice prophylactic move to defend the rook. Even if white loses an exchange, 2 minor pieces is generally enough for a rook. Certainly 3 is going to be enough for a rook. So this is actually what happened. We had this happen, and now after b6, well, now the wheels start to come off the bus. We have too many minor pieces hanging. It's really time to start to bail out. A move like d5 is an interesting way to do that, with the idea of knight e6 check. When you have the minor pieces against the rook, you really want to try and attack and do active things with your pieces, and really, we don't want to be passive. So in this case, I think that queen d3 is a little bit passive, and it allows black to get a piece back. Once again, the rook probably not worth quite enough here. I think white's still doing very well, but it's no longer as good. Like, we can't say that white's up 2 minor pieces now. Now it's a roughly equal material. So after king c8, because this is of course a discovered check, we had queen c4, and now black decided to just throw the pawns forward on the king's side. I don't love f3, but we'll just keep going. There's not so many moves that are horrible here, and unfortunately for white, this was kind of his last chance to really close out the game. I think that a plan of just taking this exchange to just be up this minor piece is the way to go. Here we have the move queen a2. I personally like the move c6. I think it's a flashy counterattack against the black queen. Even something like this, we're making a brand new queen. This would be good. But this was really the last chance for white to cleanly put the game away by capturing the rook. So instead, after knight e4, we had queen d5 happen, And now, all of a sudden, black really does have some decent play. So we had a couple more moves. Bishop takes f6, and we're winning a pawn, yes, but the pieces are a little bit tenuous now. And after g4, f4, this is when disaster strikes. And now black really is winning the game. Black has an extra exchange, and even though white has this f4 pawn, it's not enough, and we see that black gets this pawn back, and the rook and queen are going to combine for a decisive attack against the white king, and that's really going to be enough for black to win the game and really complete this nice turnaround. So white tries to trade off the queens. Unfortunately, black is keen to this trick and keeps the queens on the board, and now goes for this really nice trick and wins the queen. And we'll show the rest of the game quickly, but black played very, very cleanly to control this passed pawn and push his own passed pawn home to make a second queen. And two queens, if you don't stalemate your opponent, it's almost always going to lead to a very nice quick mate, and that's exactly what happened here. And black was able to complete this comeback, which is a really, really nice way for Bill to end his tournament.
Absolutely. Yeah, we saw some.
Yeah. Sure. Sorry, go ahead.
No, please, please, by all means, wrap it up.
I think that Tyler played a really nice game here, and it really almost went his way, and he was probably one good move away from putting the game out of reach. And I think Tyler really had one of the nicest conversions that we saw between like some mistakes early in the tournament and playing some really good chess late in the event.
Absolutely. I think we saw a tremendous amount of growth out of him, and I was disappointed to not see him find a little bit more on the scoreboard. But I have faith that if he continues to play, he is going to see results in time. One player who is no stranger to having some results in this tournament is Rufus. Rufus had a very nice effort this week against Chris White, although there were some major ups and downs that are perhaps fitting for the last round of a tournament in which fall is coming on, people are tired, and I think getting a little distracted with all the activity that fall brings. So here is the game, right? We have some fairly typical opening moves. This bishop e6 move is not a move that I've seen very often in the Philidor defense.
I like it because bishop c4 is also not the mainline move. If d4 instead, well, now bishop e6 is just silly. But it's an interesting way to play to try and unbalance the game right out of the gate. And I do think that this worked out well for black. He gets an extra center pawn, and white is a long way away from taking advantage of this weak diagonal.
Yeah, absolutely. I will say, I've talked so much about the weakness of moving the f-pawn, but we do see as we learn to play and study at a higher level, so many exceptions to this rule as many other rules of thumb. If white is not in a position to take advantage, a weakness is not a weakness. But I will say that after a little bit more sort of unusual play, right, the knight coming to a6 is an example, right, some sort of strange setup things. One of the things that I really do not like is coming very shortly in this game, which is another example, I think, of castling into it. Here, I think maybe the idea of playing c5 to offer a vice grip on this d4 square, closing things up and allowing black to castle kingside with total control in the center would have been a nice effort. Instead,
our extra e6 pawn really makes a difference after c5.
Yeah, very, very good point. Absolutely, right? The fact that this pawn is here helping to make sure that the ordinary problem of playing something like c5, giving away this d5 square, is simply not an issue. But instead, black went with some sort of unusual moves. So b6 is a little passive, but not any kind of major problem. But here, I think that castles queenside is one of the more deadly examples of castling that we've seen in this tournament. It reminds me a little bit of Rufus' game against Charlie Larimer some weeks ago, where actually black had all but sewn that game up and then ended up castling into some very nice attacking opportunities. Here, I think you've got to notice the fact that, number one, many of white's pieces are pointing in that direction. Number two, that this pawn has already been advanced, which helps the rook come into play more quickly. And three, that this move of b6 has created what we call a hook, right? A pawn that is already advanced and gives white an opportunity to play forward and open the file. So all of these add up to a big, big wrong way sign that black should have heeded. Now, white wasn't able to convert immediately on this attack, but I don't think this is the kind of thing you want to be doing long term. So white finds the right plan at first, right? Playing a5 and taking the file for himself. I think here, queen e2 makes sense, right? Trying to put some X-ray pressure on this a6 knight. And I thought after rook a8 that the most logical way to continue was to play this immediate d4, right?
Yeah, and just about, can we stop for one quick second?
Please, I wish you would.
Thank you, my pleasure. Even here, rook takes a6 is a consideration. We don't generally want to give up exchanges willy-nilly, but we're trading off the best defender of the black king. To be fair, this is not the best way to play. I'm sure there are many other ways for white to consolidate an advantage because the black king is so weak, but a move like this really is possible already just because the black king is so isolated and we have this really nice lead in development. I think this is kind of an instructive moment. It's not often that giving up an exchange in play at the class level, so below 2000, is anything other than a mistake. But I think here, this is a real opportunity for white to show that the A file is just deadly. And probably I would continue with queen e2 so that the rook can come here and the queen can cover the light squares. But I just thought this was kind of an interesting moment. And this would have been a real chance for white to try and win right away.
Is this the kind of sophisticated dynamic play that we can expect from you against your opponents on Sunday from 2 to 5?
Certainly, I would be tempted to just throw an exchange away and hope for the best. So I think this is something that really could happen. And even here, I think that I would play queen e2, but even d4 is a consideration. And I can safely say that white is not worse in this position. I think white could have done better than giving the exchange away, but this is just kind of one of those positions where why not? Like, let's throw a rook away and try and take advantage of our lead in development, and something good will happen. I don't necessarily know what it is. I don't know how it's going to work out, but the king's open, the light squares are weak, I have an extra knight over there. Something good will happen.
There's a moon out tonight and I'm feeling romantic.
Exactly.
It's nice to know that that spirit is still alive and well, even in 2020.
Back to our sleazy chess.
Moving on. We've got to get through these games. It's 8:08. Moving on. So I like queen e2 well enough, and I thought a consistent way to open up here was to play this d4 move and keep the pressure going. Instead, Rufus makes, I think, what appears to be very logical, but a very dangerous move, which is he plays rook to a3. Now, I can understand how rook to a2, he was worried about being met with maybe something annoying like knight b4, right, and inviting trades, or some such. But rook to a3, unfortunately, allows his opponent this very nice discovery opportunity. d5 is threatening a fatal fork on d4, but the critical issue here is the fact that the bishop is on f8 looking at your castle. And it is bad news. Rufus dealt with the immediate threat of the fork. Well, excuse me, I suppose they're both immediate, but he dealt with this well enough, right? Maybe here, knight takes e5 was a way to try and push the tactical battle back onto his opponent, as now something like queen to d6, trying to keep control of the tempo battle, blocks the bishop's route to the rook and also potentially hangs this knight f7 fork out in the wind. So this probably was his last chance to maintain an advantage. Instead, by trading the pawns, he gives away the exchange. And black is now doing quite well, and I think that the battle has shifted. The only thing keeping white in the game at this point is probably the fact that this king is still pretty flimsy, and he may have attacking chances as the game continues to open up. However, not to be deterred, Rufus did do his best to keep pieces on the board and avoid exchanging, right? Rook to b1 makes sense, trying to take aim at that monarch and keep some pressure on. Maybe we have ideas now of entering on these squares because the pawn will be pinned. Knight to c5, right? And now I think this is where really black should have been able perhaps to try and put this game away with a little bit more accurate play. Rufus g3 here really starts to weaken the squares around the king and is probably not the right bid. And I think here maybe something like h5 or even maybe bringing just the rooks to the center might have been a better look. G5 is okay.
Yeah,
right?
so just to back up one quick second, the move played in the game was G5. G5 is not the right way to take advantage of this pawn on G3. And you already alluded to this with B6 being a hook for our attack. H5 is the correct way to take advantage of that and open up a file on the king side. All that said, it's opposite side castling. I think it's really important to make sure that your king is safe first. King safety really always has to be the first consideration. And for that reason, I think that black should really try and close up the queen side first and only then look for a move like h5. So the move that I thought about when I was looking at this quickly was rook h to d8. That way we keep the rook on the a file eyeing this a3 pawn, but we're threatening to capture on d4 immediately and win 2 pieces for the rook. And if we have a move like knight b5, well, now black can start to trade everything off in the center, and this rook coming to d3 would really be a nice way to close out the game. Something like this, and even though there are discoveries, there's not a useful discovery. The rook is diagonally opposed from the knight. This box really shows that the knight has no future of getting here. It actually takes a whole bunch of moves for the knight to get to a square 2 steps away from it diagonally. And because of that, there's no useful discovery, and black's doing exceptionally well here up in exchange.
Absolutely. Yeah, this would have been a much better bid than, unfortunately, what happened. As it was, g5 did provoke another mistake from Rufus. This move, f4, right, is only helping black's case. And I think here, just taking, right, making the g file another potential open lane to attack would have been the right play. As we see after g takes h4, rook h to g8 check, king h1, the queen drops back to avoid being taken by the pawn. And although white can make some attacking moves, right, this queen to c6, Andrew, that you noted earlier, right, is an incredible attempt to set up another nasty discovery, right? E takes d3 check is in the wind, which will win the queen either here, or if she retreats wisely to g2, unfortunately, she'll be met with check and mate. Yes. So this looks like an excellent way to continue, but black could not resist the temptation and took en passant, right? Perhaps because he loves this term, right, and wants to speak more French. But this is absolutely the wrong way to go, as we can see very, very simply that white is able to take back with a check, and suddenly these queenside issues are back with a vengeance, right? Blocking with c6 is absolutely a cardboard box. There's nothing there. White will simply take and keep his attack going. I think probably either capture here is going to be really nasty. Probably knight c6 is even worse because of the threat to the queen. So instead, very wisely, we played king to a6. But all of a sudden, white's attacking chances are legion. And here we once again see another one of these problems. Now, black is already was in trouble, but I have to say that I do not love this g4 move. I think probably some kind of attempt to more actively employ his pieces was in order. Maybe even
so there
something
are
like
a couple of ways to think about this. Yeah. When you have an opposite side castling position, the most important thing is going to be getting an open file against your opponent's king. Also, I think keeping the queens on in an opposite side castling position, if you have any attacking chances, keep the queens on. So those 2 things can really contribute to black's idea of not allowing the queen trade, and moreover, g4, there's no hope of opening a king side file here. Yeah, the f file's already open, but there's no mate on f2. The bishop's covering it sufficiently. There's rook f1 to kind of clean it up. So I think that at least with the pawn on g5, if you move the queen somewhere, you have prayers of playing h5 and h4 to try and open up things this way. So, and if we back up even further, this is, and Rufus said in the chat, f4 is pretty bad. It's so bad because we're opening a file. And having an open file against the king, that's really a decisive effect. There's no open file on the queen's side, at least not yet, although black's going to have to allow white to have an open file sooner or later. But in this position after f4, there's an open file immediately, and black should be winning, at least speaking from a principle standpoint.
Absolutely. So this, another example of what might have been. Instead, we see another I'll take your queen, you take mine kind of situation, which plays into white's hands as he has this nasty fork at the end, knight takes c7, picking up an exchange, right, trading off more pieces, and when the wreckage clears, suddenly no longer nearly as much drama, and white is up a boatload of pawns, and he was not deterred from converting the game very shortly thereafter. Yes, I have to say, though, this, right, perhaps Chris knew that he was dead, but this rook e1 check, bringing the rooks off the board along with everything else, was definitely not the way to keep complications and fight on. But after this, I can't say there's really much that black could have done. And there's not too much here that's worth discussing.
No, white Rufus put it away very cleanly after that.
Absolutely. Moving into our final game of the evening, I want to say one thing before we begin, which is that Brian Curry has played some very nice games over the course of this tournament. His results have been a little bit uneven, but I think he has not perhaps gotten as much attention in this broadcast as I would like, and I thought this was a very nice effort from him in round 7, and he deserves a shout-out. So well done to you, Brian. I was impressed with this game.
Yeah, so let's get right into it. This was a exciting King's Indian type setup right out of the gate. This bishop g5 idea is kind of a modern way of playing it, although it dates back to really early days when the King's Indian was brand new, so I can't really say it's modern. But this idea of playing bishop g5 to really try and undermine this knight, which is one of black's better minor pieces in the King's Indian, is a creative way of playing. The general theory involves starting with h6 to chase the bishop away, because the bishop is on its best square on g5, and h6 doesn't really create too many weaknesses. Even after black castles, the king can come to h7 defending this h6 pawn. All right, so after bishop g5, instead black played knight c6, and this is kind of known to be a subpar move in the King's Indian. We don't want to play knight c6 before e5 because it allows white the chance to play d5, and after knight e5, white has the idea of capturing on e5, and these doubled e-pawns are really, really bad for black in the King's Indian. White found that idea. White found d5, and after knight e5, he took, and e4 was played, and we have a really nice position for white right out of the opening. This bishop is now restricted by this e5 pawn. The only sane way to have an advantage as black with a bishop on g7 and a pawn on e5 is if the knight can come to d4. Unfortunately, there's no legal way to get the knight to d4, and anything that we would try to do that would hang the knight on either c6 or e6, so it's just not going to happen this game. So this is kind of a known thing. These doubled e-pawns are bad, and white, I can comfortably say, has a nice advantage.
It is interesting to note, Andrew, that black so often in these positions plays this e5 move on purpose, but always with a mind of either getting control of this d4 square, or in some cases, when he attacks on the king side, being able to take later and open the bishop back up. And in this situation, because of the way the pieces are combining with the pawns, there's just no way to make any of those plans happen in a fruitful way.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a really good point. And as we go through the game, I think we'll see some of the reasons that it's so detrimental to have that extra pawn on e5. Okay, here, instead of queen c1 lines up the queen and the bishop. But why not queen d2? Queen d2 opens the king for castling, and the difference between c1 and d2, I don't see any difference whatsoever. So get the piece off of the last rank, get closer to connecting rooks. I think queen d2 would have just been a better move. In fact, we shortly see that white saw the error of his ways and moved the queen off of the back rank in order to connect rooks and open the c file for a rook. So we had a couple more moves happen, and after rook c1, we start to see that white is starting to threaten stuff in the center. The move d6 is actually a threat right now. And after d takes d6, e takes d6, queen takes d6, white would have a very clean advantage. This e pawn would be forever blocking the bishop, and white would have nice control over the d file. Black dealt with that by playing bishop c8, and this is kind of one of the nice things about bishops. They can do everything that they need to from afar. They don't have to worry about going back to move to squares like b1 or c8. They still have a full range of the diagonal, even if they're all the way back. And here it's not in the way of the rook. White got out of the way with queen e1, and black took this opportunity to chase the bishop, a move that he could have played on move 5, but now after h6, I think that black is starting to dig his way out. And now after knight g4, black is threatening to capture this bishop on e3 and really turn the game around and clean up the game, have the bishop pair, have a decent position. So I think this is a really instructive moment. And white saw that he should not allow knight takes e3 no matter what. And instead he played bishop takes g4. And this is a really good example of removing the opponent's best minor piece. Yes, black has the bishop pair. The bishop pair is generally a really good thing to have. But in this position, white has the move f3, and black's bishops don't have much of a future. The bishop has to go back to d7 or c8, and on d7 or c8, the bishop only controls this diagonal. The dark square bishop only controls these very few squares, and I think that white's knight, even though it's not doing anything yet, is the best minor piece on the board. Although,
and Andrew, I have to break in here. One of my favorite pieces of chess slang that I don't know if we've had an opportunity to mention yet on the show is when you have bishops this bad, it's hard to refer to them as anything better than tall pawns.
Yes, definitely. And at least tall pawns can move forward. Bishops can't even move forward. So in this case, I think white has consolidated a very nice advantage, and white goes on to really take control of the dark squares by playing bishop b6, a striking repositioning of the dark square bishop from the king side to the queen side. And after queen b8, he continues his dark square domination by putting the knight on a dark square. And now, unfortunately, black gives away a minor piece, and white is now going to be able to show his technique to try and close out the game. Black does complicate matters. He's attacking both pieces. White finds the only move, defending the knight with an X-ray tactic. And after the queen moves, white immediately untangles. And this is kind of another instructive moment. When you're up material, it's time to consolidate, draw back, put the pieces on safe squares, and make sure that you're not going to hang any material. Bishop f2 is a perfect way to do that. Get the bishop out of dodge, and now the knight is the only piece that we have to take care of. And in fact, we're giving the knight this beautiful b6 square where the bishop will be able to defend it. All right, so we have a couple more moves. h5. Because black didn't do anything on the queen side with the move h5, white takes advantage and plays the move knight c5, trying to win yet another pawn. Black defends that. White gets the rook back, although I don't love this move. I think a move like rook c to d1 might have been a little bit more to the point, really trying to take control of the D file. But, anyways, I think when you're up a piece, you can almost do anything you want. And now we have a couple more moves before we get to one other instructive position. I do like that white put his knight on the best square, d5. And let's just get to the position that I wanted to talk about. And we see finally that white is trying to attack this g5 pawn. We're not quite there, but white is now starting to threaten the move f4. And we have the move f4 because the g pawn is pinned, and after a move like e takes f4, we can recapture with the bishop. Then we would be threatening e5 to undermine this g5 pawn, and white is really trying to break through on the king side to checkmate black because white has the extra piece. We can attack with that extra piece. Here, black tried to move the queen out of the way of the f-file, and every single one of black's pieces is going to try and stop this f4 break. So, seeing that f4 is solidly prevented by the black pieces, we get to our move of the week when white played f4. White ignores all of the threats, and tactically it works out beautifully. First of all, the g-pawn cannot capture because it's pinned to the king, and if we have the move e takes f4, then there's knight takes f4, and we're forking the king and the queen. So this is just a really nice way to close out the game, and after f4, black's position collapses almost immediately.
I have to note here that had we had this continuation, that would have been the second time in the tournament that Brian put a Larimer away with this exact tactic, right? He had the mirror image of it in a previous game against Robert some weeks ago.
Yes, that was also a very nice game. So here, black got out of the way of that, but unfortunately the position is just collapsing, and now we see this very nice move f5, and white was able to break through with f6. Of course we can't take. This is a really nice fork. We call these royal forks. And after this, we have a pawn on the 7th. Anytime there's a pawn on the 7th, there are going to be promotion tactics, and white was able to immediately threaten moves like knight f6. Black slowed that down. Unfortunately, this e8 square is insufficiently defended, so white is going to try and trade off the queens in order to break through to the e8 square, and without further ado, white pushed his pawns home and made a second queen and closed out the game very, very nicely. And we had a couple more moves before resignation, but really the game is just over. We have way too much material for white, and this was a very clean game from white, and I think it really showcases our themes of the week: trading off the good minor piece, bishop takes g4, and active play the whole way. A move like f4, really a really nice move, shows exactly what's happening in the position, breaks open the king, and wins the game very cleanly.
Absolutely. A really nice final effort to close things out. Those are our games for the week, and that has been our tournament. I'd love to just offer a few closing remarks, if I may. And Andrew, I'm sure I'd love to hear from you on what you've seen and what we've learned. I've seen a tremendous amount of growth from our players. I've really enjoyed talking with all of you, watching you shift your processes, take our adjustments, and participate in our events. We will absolutely be doing another tournament, as we've said, in October, and I would love to hear from you any thoughts you might have about what worked, what didn't, what you might like to see in a future offering. We are planning on charging some small registration fee to participate in that tournament. We are figuring that out as we speak. So we are very eager to hear from you about your plans to participate. I would love to be able to not only field this number of players again, but maybe have enough participation that we could have sections. So for those of you who maybe had a tougher tournament this time around, we could set an under 1,300, under 1,400 play, where maybe we have enough players to offer everyone in the bottom half a chance to win their own section instead of having to play in the open. We can only do that if we have enough players. So please tell your friends about this, bring everybody in, And we will do our best to make sure that no matter how many players we have, we still continue to have this kind of intimate community experience, looking at games and learning together. Thank you all so much for participating. It's been such a pleasure to make this show every week. And we're having a great time. Andrew, anything that you want to tell our viewers and our players?
I think you summed it up very well. It's been a ton of fun. John, thank you so much for including me. I think these have been some really instructive games. It's been a lot of fun to look at them every week and follow along and see how everybody's doing. Aaron, congratulations once again. You played a fantastic tournament. And to everybody else, I really enjoyed looking at your games. And just to steal a moment, I hope that everybody shows up on Sunday at 2 for a simul. I'm going to try and beat absolutely everybody, but we will see how that goes. And I think I'm going to have my hands full. It's a lot of strong chess that we've seen over the last 7 weeks.
Absolutely. I am very much looking forward to that and hoping to offer some of my commentary along with yours during that simul. So please, if you are planning on participating, I think go ahead and email me. I know based on the poll that we put out about many of you, but I'm certainly happy to hear if any of you want to confirm your appearance in that tournament, because I am going to start putting out feelers to other players to try and fill the ranks just a little bit more, just to really put the screws to Andrew and stress him out and see what he's capable of. I think
Definitely.
we all benefit.
But
So
it will be right here on this channel. Show up on twitch.tv/acceptablechess. And we will see everybody on Sunday at 2. And we will see how the games go.
Absolutely. So once again, for Andrew Hoy, I am John Harden, and this has been another wonderful episode of Acceptable Chess.